This was a High Court ruling. It is largely driven by precedent. You're likely to take this to the Supreme Court. Do you expect a different outcome? Do you expect the Supreme Court to rule against the Prime Minister when it comes to the suspension of Parliament?
Well, no one can say for certain because this is such an unusual case. Because we have an unwritten constitution, we are arguing about democracy, the very fundamentals of our system, and about abuse of power. So this is a very, very unusual case. What is very positive today is that the case wasn't dismissed. We were actually granted, I was granted an appeal up to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, and they said that the case has merit. So I would argue that the case needs to be heard in the Supreme Court. Also, what's very unusual is the Supreme Court in the UK doesn't normally sit until October. So the 9 judges that we suspect will be called back early. So this is very unusual to hear the case on the 17th of September. So it's by no means over, and it does actually show you how important this case is.
Gina, why does Parliament need you and John Major and all these others to protect it? If Parliament wanted to get rid of this proroguing, all it would have to do is basically have a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister's government. That is how this could be decided, and then we could have parliamentary sovereignty re-established, some would argue. Parliament doesn't seem to want to do this. Shouldn't the emphasis be on Parliament rather than you?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, as it was in my first case and now, it shouldn't be up to me. But unfortunately, the way this Prime Minister is operating is actually shutting down the options from the ministers in Parliament. Because if there, say, is on Monday a vote, he looks for a vote under the Fixed Term Act for a general election, and he doesn't get that, he could prorogue Parliament because he already has the Queen's signature saying that he can prorogue Parliament between the 9th and the 12th of September for 5 weeks. So the ministers won't have the opportunity to stop him. That is why even before, now more than ever, when I started this case, this has now become front and centre and even more important than I originally anticipated.
And just for context, let's remind viewers that you actually brought and won the case that stopped ministers triggering Article 50 without that parliamentary vote back in 2017, so you've been along for the ride, as it were. Now, Boris Johnson argues that this is political and not legal, and that there is no reason for a court to be involved in the decision and the deciding of this. What are you trying to convince the court, Gina?
Well, Boris Johnson would say that, but we would argue that this is an abuse of his power. We're not arguing that a Prime Minister doesn't have this power to prorogue Parliament. We're saying it's an abuse and a misuse of that power because throughout history for 40 years, no Prime Minister has prorogued Parliament for this time. The average time is 3 to 4 weeks. And at such a fundamental time in our history as we drift towards a no-deal Brexit, ministers are saying they want to be able to sit. They want to be able to minimise the damage and to have their say to scrutinise. And he is denying them that voice. And that is an abuse of power because we are a parliamentary democracy. So whilst he is trying to close down their voices, I have a platform from which I can, from a civic point of view, fight against the sort of tyranny that he is trying to exercise in our country.
Gina, is there a point to be made, and I'm sure Boris Johnson would make this point, that he is only trying to enact the original will of the people, the vote that was voted upon to carry out Brexit by October 31st, as was promised?
I'm sorry, but this has nothing to do with Brexit. This is so much more fundamental than Brexit. This is not about remain or leave.
But
because we have an unwritten constitution. Because we have an unwritten constitution, if he gets away with this, it sets a precedent that any Prime Minister in future can decide if they don't like the scrutiny of Parliament, they'll just shut it down. This is so much bigger than Brexit. It's not about one moment in political history. This is about our entire constitution.
Absolutely, and I'm not arguing that, but I'm saying in this particular case, it just happens to be about Brexit, and he is saying that he needs to prorogue Parliament in order to carry out the will of the people. Well,
he would say that, wouldn't he? But it's still an abuse of power. No Prime Minister is above the law. And just to say that excuse, the effect of it would be to shut down Parliament. He doesn't need to shut down Parliament for 5 weeks to get a new session, to get a Queen's speech. He could do that in the normal precedent way, which is about 3 to 4 even days or a week. He does not need 5 weeks. There is no justification for shutting down Parliament for 5 weeks.
Gina, is the only way that ultimately this gets resolved with legislation that basically changes the terms around which this can happen? Is that the long-term trajectory here, that we see Parliament enacting legislation?
I think if Parliament wishes to do so, then they can do so. But we've got a long way before we get there because, you know, there are rumours flying around that if he doesn't win the vote on Monday for a general election, he may have to resign. There are so many other things, moving parts in Brexit. There is no clear path ahead. All I'm interested in is that the Prime Minister obeys the law and does not abuse his powers. But apart from that, I don't think we with any certainty can say we know how this is going to end as yet.